My name is Christy Nelson, and I'm with the Summit Historical Society. I want to thank you for joining us today on our tour of the lost towns of Summit County. Now, we're only going to be looking at a few of the towns and mining camps that dotted our county at one time or another, but are no longer here. I want to start, though, by thanking our corporate sponsor, iFurnish of Frisco, Colorado, for making this program possible. Our first tour is of gold mining towns. Now, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush started in 1859. And with that gold rush, miners and prospectors from all over the country came into our state, and many of them flooded into Summit County. After gold was discovered in the Blue River, near what today is Breckenridge, prospectors were all over the gulches, and mining claims sprouted up throughout the landscape. Now, these are a few of the gold mining towns that sprang up near the hundreds of mine claims. For the sake of our discussion today, we're going to distinguish towns from mining camps by whether or not they had a post office. Let's start our tour in Parkville. Now, as you look at this map, I've indicated Parkville as the red spot to the right of the name of Breckenridge. Parkville is up the hill from Breckenridge. In fact, most of the miners that came into Parkville flooded over Georgia Pass. So you can see Georgia Pass. Parkville is one of the first places that you would come to. In 1869, there were 1,800 miners in the town of Parkville. Now, there are no pictures of what it looked like. We only have the Masonic monument that marks the place where the town existed. In 1935, there were still some remnants of the town, but today you'd find nothing but the marker. At its height, 10,000 miners were living in the narrow gulch of Georgia Gulch. The community of Parkville became a supply center for the entire Georgia Gulch, as well as the social center. It was the town of Summit County and almost became our territorial capital. The town consisted of a post office, a mint that produced $2.50, $5, and $10 gold pieces, a hotel, 2 general stores, 3 saloons, a grand hall where nightly dances took place, a theater, a drugstore, a meat market, a saddle and harness shop, and the first Summit County brewery, the Henry Weiss Brewery out of Pueblo. Parkville was made the county seat when the Colorado Territory was established in 1861, but it only remained the county seat for a few months. So, as I mentioned, Parkville only remained the county seat for just a few months. It was in the spring of 1862 that mysteriously county records were moved to Breckenridge. Some say they were stolen in the dead of night. Others say that the commissioners of both Parkville and Breckenridge worked out the move. Well, it was not unheard of at that time for towns to steal county records in order to establish themselves as county seats. I'm originally from Illinois. I grew up in the town of Naperville, and Naperville was the county seat in the 1800s of DuPage County. But in the dead of night, There were horseback riders that came into town, stole our county records, and moved them to Wheaton. And today, Wheaton, Illinois is the county seat of DuPage. Well, what do you think? Parkville did not want to lose the county seat. You decide. So Parkville met its demise in 1882. What happened? Well, the mining operations moved to hydraulic mining. And as you can see from this picture, hydraulic mining is where they take a high-powered hose and they spray down the mountainside to loosen up the rocks. Well, it didn't bode well for Parkville. The gravel tailings created a rock slide that buried the town, and the post office was closed. Thus, Parkville did not exist any longer. Let's move on to another mining town. This is Lincoln City. Now, Lincoln City is up a different gulch. It's up French Gulch, and it's up in the area of Farncombe Hill. Now, what was particularly interesting about Lincoln City, is that it was in the area where wire gold was mined. Wire gold had a different look than other gold, and you can see it from the picture on this slide. You may have heard the story about Tom's Baby being a 13-pound piece of wire gold. That's the kind of gold that Lincoln City would have been involved in their mining. So the Lincoln City was a fairly large town with a population in the 1800s of around 1,500 people. It had the first school in Summit County. When the gold began to play out and the town died, the post office closed. I want you to keep in mind what keeps happening with the post office, because that determines whether a town is viable or not, is if the post office closes. So now let's take a trip over to Swan City. Swan City is located off of the Swan River, just down from Parkville. In fact, about the time that Parkville was meeting its demise, Swan City was just beginning. It was situated in a timber forest next to the Swan River. In 1974 and 75, John Doherty was hired by the Summit Historical Society to take photographs of the mines of Summit County. He found that there wasn't anything left of Swan City, and his photographs show that. By 1883, the Swan City had a hotel, a post office, a school, a general store, a couple of saloons, and the population was just 300. By 1898, with the dwindling gold, the town had died and the post office had closed. Now, when the dredge boats came up the Swan River, of course they left tailings all along the way, but when they came to the place where Swan City was located, a funny thing happened. They found that there was more gold under the town site than there was throughout the area. So the poor folks of Swan City didn't realize they were sitting on a gold mine. So now we're going to travel up the Swan River, and we're going to go all the way up to what we call the Middle Swan, to a town that's right near the Continental Divide, and that's Swandike. Land developers did an effective job of marketing the area, and by 1898, There was a post office and 200 people living up at the Continental Divide. Well, needless to say, it was very difficult to live up there and to get supplies up there. And so the town lasted only 12 years and then died as the gold dwindled and the post office closed. In 1975, this was all that was left of the Swandike site. Going back down the Swan River, we're now going to take a look at a town that came about much later than the ones we've already discussed. We're talking about the town of Tiger. It's located on the Swan River about 5 miles east of Highway 9 off of Tiger Road. In 1917, John A. Traylor, founder of the Royal Tiger Mine Company, purchased most of the major mines in the area, including Tiger, Cashier, the Jesse Mine, the Wellington, the Rose of Breckenridge, the Mini Mine, Wire Patch, and the French Creek Tunnel. Tiger was a company town of the Royal Tiger Mine Company. Men with families were encouraged to come and work the mine. The town hosted a post office, a schoolhouse, a general store, a hospital, rooming houses for single men, cottages and cabins for families, and with almost all the modern conveniences. Unfortunately, more money was invested in the mines that came out of them. And so in 1938, the Royal Tiger Mine Company filed for bankruptcy. By 1940, the town was abandoned, the post office was closed, and it became a ghost town. Now, an interesting thing about Tiger is that in the 1960s, squatters became a real problem in what was left of the town. So in 1973, the U.S. Forest Service burned the town down to take care of the squatter problem. So now we're on to a town that is nowhere near where we've been before. It's Boston. And if you look at the map, you're going to see Boston is on the road heading up to Fremont Pass. In fact, it's located up in Mayflower Gulch. If you hike up Mayflower Gulch, you're going to find some remnants of a town. Well, no, it wasn't really a town. It was a mining camp because it never had a post office. You'll see the remnants of cabins of the mining operation. Now, the operation really was only from 1903 to 1930. And then the gold was dwindling and it wasn't really making the money that it needed to, and so they closed it down. Then in 1933, during the Depression, unemployed Denverites came up to the Boston mining camp and tried to eke out a survival with the gold that was left over. So although Boston wasn't an actual town, it had a great history. So let's do a quick review of the gold mining towns. Obviously, Breckenridge was where the gold was first discovered, but it is not a lost town. But Parkville met its demise from a rock slide of tailings that destroyed the town, which obviously closed the post office. Lincoln City also closed its post office in 1993 when the gold played out. Swan City was also, the gold dwindled and the post office closed. And then there was Swandike, same thing. The gold dwindled and the post office closed. Tiger, on the other hand, didn't start until 1938, filed for bankruptcy, and the town was abandoned, the post office was closed, and it became a ghost town. Of course, Frisco did have some gold, but it's still around. And then there was the Boston mining camp that closed its operation in 1930, but was revived by unemployed Denverites during the Depression. So let's take a look at silver mining towns. Now we know that gold mining was big in parts of the county, but silver mining also had an effect on our county's history. There are actually two areas where you'll find silver located. You had the Montezuma and Peru Creek district on the east side of the county, and then over on the west side, going up 10 Mile Creek, you'll find the 10 Mile Creek district. Let's start over in the Montezuma district with Saints John. Saints John is actually where the silver was discovered back in 1863. Prospectors flooded into the area over Argentine Pass from Georgetown. So as they came in and started mining, they started establishing towns, and it was in 1867 that Saints John started functioning as a town. Saints John was always a company town. In 1878, the Boston Mining Company bought the mine and the town. It was run by very refined Bostonians. Saints John had no saloons, but it had a 350-volume library. The dining room used fine china, and expensive furniture was found in many of the homes. It also had a post office for a short time. The Panic of 1893 and the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act greatly impacted silver mining in Summit County. When currency was no longer backed by both gold and silver, the price of silver dropped drastically, and the silver mining industry in Summit County declined. By 1898, Saints John, the town, was abandoned. The townspeople just walked away and left everything. Later, that fine furniture that was in the Saints John's homes ended up in homes in Montezuma. So when the miners of Saints John wanted some liquid libation, they would have to go down the mountain 2 miles to the town of Montezuma. Well, let's talk a bit about Montezuma. Montezuma is located on the Snake River, just up from Keystone, actually. It got its start in 1868. Now, in September of 1881, Montezuma was incorporated with a population of 745. And by 1884, Montezuma was well established with more than 100 buildings, including comfortable homes, a bank, a school, a Catholic church, a post office, a newspaper, 3 general stores, 3 hotels, several restaurants, boarding houses, and a large number of saloons, not to mention brothels. The population of Montezuma had begun to dwindle in 1890. And although it was hit hard by the Panic of 1893, it did not become a ghost town like the other towns in the district. In the 1970s, Montezuma became an off-the-grid place for folks to live. And it continued on through the era of the ski industry because Keystone was right down the road. And today, Montezuma has a number of second homeowners. So traveling up Peru Creek from Montezuma, we come to the town of Chihuahua. Oh, not that kind of Chihuahua. Chihuahua was a town that started in 1880 and only lasted 9 years. It was a busy mining town. In 1881, there were over 50 buildings and a population of 200. It had a post office, 2 hotels, 3 restaurants, and 3 saloons. It even had a dressmaking shop and bonnet shop. It was quite the social scene with fancy balls. In 1889, a forest fire destroyed the town and only a few cabins remain. So now we're going to continue on up Peru Creek to the town of Argentine. Well, actually, it's known as the town with 3 names. In 1868, the town of Decatur was laid out on Peru Creek by Commodore Stephen Decatur. In 1879, the town grows as a result of the Pennsylvania mine Silver Strike. By 1881, though, the town population is 300, and they take steps to incorporate. In 1885, the town of Decatur began to dwindle in size, and the post office closed. The town is now deserted. In 1893, though, the town tries to revive itself. But in order to get a new post office, they had to rename the town. Thus, the name Rathbone. A snowslide off of Gray's Peak demolished the town of Rathbone in 1898. Now, going back to 1881, Decatur had been located very close to a very small town that was named Argentine. When Rathbone was wiped out by the snowslide, the people of Rathbone decided to rebuild over in Argentine. But by 1907, the Argentine post office was closed and only a few cabins remain. Now we're going to move away from the Peru Creek and Montezuma district over to the 10 Mile. We know that Frisco had silver, but of course Frisco's not lost yet. So let's take a look at Kokomo. Kokomo, and sometimes referred to as Kokomo Racine, is from 1879 to 1965. And it's located up on Route 91 as you're going up towards Climax. Now, Kokomo and Racine started as 2 separate towns. In 1879, the population in Kokomo was 1,500. Some of the 1879 businesses, according to the Clark Route Directory, included a post office, 4 dry goods stores, a furniture store, 17 groceries, 4 hardware stores, 11 hotels, 23 liquor establishments, 19 restaurants, 30 cigar stores, and a bowling alley. But alas, in 1881, a fire destroyed Kokomo. So the townspeople decided to build the new town over in Racine. For a while, the town was called Kokomo Racine, but finally it was just known as Kokomo. After the silver panic in 1893, the town struggled. But when the Climax mine opened in 1925, many of the miners and families lived in Kokomo, so it had a mini revival. In 1959, Climax purchased the land that Kokomo was on for future tailings, mine tailings. When the Climax mine closed in 1962, Kokomo died. In 1965, the post office closed. And in 1966, the townspeople had the graves in the cemetery moved to Valley Brook in Breckenridge. And in 1971, all the buildings were destroyed. Farther up on the 10-Mile Creek, we come to the town of Robinson. Robinson was established in 1879 until 1911 and is located above Kokomo, just 2 miles up on Sheep Mountain's eastern slope. During the first month of Leadville's big silver strike, a man named George B. Robinson grub-staked or outfitted a couple of prospectors to explore the upper 10-mile region. The two men located several good mine claims in the area, and the race was on. The first residents of Robinson felt that it would become a town that would rival Leadville, and so they set it up to be a magnificent town. Before long, Robinson had a hotel, a newspaper, a smelter, a Catholic church, several businesses, and of course, a post office. It became the biggest 1880 silver town with a population of around 2,000 in 1881. All the mines in the area played out, and the post office was closed, and Robinson became a ghost town by 1911. Today, the town of Robinson lies beneath the mine tailings of the Climax mine. Speaking of Climax, as we know today, is up towards the summit of Fremont Pass, but it has a rich history, even though it wasn't silver. In 1879, Charles Center discovers molybdenum while he was prospecting for silver. He didn't know what it was at the time or what it could be used for. So he sent his samples to a research lab to find out what this new mineral was. By 1895, it was determined that the gray mineral was molybdenum, but there was no market for it. In the early 1900s, the ore was determined to be an alloying agent for steel. So in 1925, the Climax mine opened and began shipping molybdenum. World War I increased the demand for molybdenum immensely. At times, it was the largest molybdenum mine anywhere, producing 75% of the world's supply. By 1925, the company town of Climax was established and in full swing. It provided all that residents could ever want: a school, a hospital, recreation, including a ski hill, and a post office. Now, the mine closed in 1962 and the town was destroyed. Many of the homes that were in Climax were moved up to Leadville. The mine resurrected operations in 2012 after 17 years closed, but the town was never rebuilt. So let's do a quick review of our silver mining towns. We know that St. John was where silver was first founded, but alas, it disappeared and was abandoned by 1898. Argentine, formerly Decatur and Rathbone, also was closed, with Decatur dwindling in 1885, Rathbone being wiped out by a snowslide, and then, of course, Argentine when things began to dwindle. And, of course, the post office closed. In Chihuahua, we know that it was a forest fire in 1889 that destroyed the town. Of course, Frisco was a silver town, but it's still around. And then there was Kokomo, Racine. And Kokomo, Racine actually
lasted until 1965. And finally, Robinson. Robinson, a fire destroyed part of the town and was abandoned by 1911. And Climax was a thriving town for a time, but when the mine closed, it too was destroyed in 1965. Let's move on to the logging and ranching towns and railroad towns that made a very large difference in our county. The logging industry took off with the need for timber, not only for the mines, but also for the railroads that were coming into the county and ranches that were beginning to establish. At the same time, we had homesteading that came to our county, and railroads arrived shortly thereafter. Let's take a look at a few of these towns. Let's look at Old Keystone. Now, Old Keystone is not where Keystone Ski Area is today, but rather you'll know it if you go to the Keystone Stables. Those buildings are from Old Keystone. Old Keystone was never a town with a post office, but it played an important role in that it was a large logging town, but also the railroad, when it came to the county, had a spur that went up to Keystone. And so the town of Keystone, or the area of Keystone, I should say, was for logging and for transportation out of the logging and timber area, but also for housing the railroad workers and the timber and sawmill workers. There was another sawmill that was very important, and that was in the area of the town of Wheeler. Now, Wheeler is today Copper Mountain, up the 10 Mile Creek. And it was Judge Wheeler that purchased the land at the junction of the 10 Mile and the West 10 Mile Creek for a hay and sheep ranch in 1879. But Wheeler was a wheeler dealer, and he soon realized that there was a lot of timber on his land that could be used to help with the railroads that were coming through his area. The ranch became a town with a post office, a much-needed sawmill to supply timber, and then various other businesses. But Wheeler suffered a disastrous fire in 1882, which destroyed much of the town. Along with the railroads came ranches. In 1862, the Federal Homestead Act was enacted, where a family could apply for land up to 165 acres. And then over 5 years, they had to improve it by building a house or putting in gardens or ranching with cattle. By the end of 5 years, then, they could apply and obtain permanent ownership of the land. So that was in 1862, but it took almost 20 years for the Homestead Act to take hold here in Summit County. Part of that was because they were behind in ranching surveys. In the early 1880s, the whole beginning of the ranching in Summit County took place. You found that there were a lot of miners who were disgruntled about not finding their fortune in the mines that turned to ranching, and they became our first homesteaders in the county. At one time, there were over 300 homesteads in Summit County. One of those is Lakeside. The Kenore Ranch is what it was known as most recently. And if you go way up on your map, you'll see that Lakeside is in the very top of the map up in the northern part of the county. It was a wide expanse. It was homesteaded in 1881. To begin with, a stagecoach station was set up on the Dillon-Kremling route as a rest stop for the travelers right there on the ranch. Then the Lakeside Post Office was opened in 1882, and a schoolhouse. It also had a community center where dances were held and the ranching community would gather together. Over time, the ranch grew to 3,500 acres. Part of the ranch today has been designated as open space. We'll find out in a bit what happened to the other part of the ranch. Then the railroads came to town. And the railroads made a big difference. We had two of them here in Summit County, the Denver and Rio Grande, that came from Leadville down through the 10-Mile Creek to Dillon. And that arrived in November of 82, and in December of 82, we had the second railroad, the Denver, South Park, and Pacific, that came over Boreas Pass, through Breckenridge, down to Dillon, through Frisco, with a spur that went off to Keystone, and then it too went up the 10-Mile Creek to Leadville. So we had a lot of commerce going on at that time. Supplies could get easily in and out of the county with the two railroads that were here. The railroads revolutionized the mining industry with better transportation. It also had an impact on all the towns that it went through, with more merchants springing up all the time. One of those towns that came about because of the railroad was Old Dillon. Now, Old Dillon was established in 1883, and knowing that the railroad was coming into town, they actually moved the town site 2 different times in order to be sure that it was right where the railroad station was going to be. It was critical for the growth of the town that it was right where the railroads came through. Dillon becomes a major mercantile area and a supply route to all of the mining district up in Montezuma, as well as the northern part of our county, which was ranching. So what happened to the railroads? Well, as mining declined, the railroads began to also see a decline. But it really was the emergence of our road systems, with automobiles and trucks traveling over the passes into the county, that really destroyed the railroad business. So the Denver and Rio Grande stopped service in February of 1911. And in 1937, the Denver South Park stopped running. And in 1938, all the rails, the tracks were removed. So let's take a quick review of the logging and ranching and railroad towns. We know that Old Keystone wasn't actually a town, but it played a very important role in our county. But as the railroads pulled out, it went by the wayside. Wheeler was destroyed by fire and went back to being a ranch, which was its original purpose, so it went away. Lakeside still continues to be a ranch at this point. Old Dillon becomes very important in the railroad scene as both of the railroads come through Dillon. And of course, Frisco and Breckenridge grow because of the railroads. We want to take a switch now and go over and talk about water projects, because that had a great impact on our towns in the county. Let's look at our water project towns. We had 2 different water projects in Summit County. One of them was the Green Mountain Reservoir, which was built between 1938 and 1942. The water was diverted for the Colorado Big Thompson project, and the water ended up going to Fort Collins. The second project was in the middle of the county, the Lake Dillon Reservoir project. And of course, it was built 1961 to 1963 and provides water to Denver. So let's take a look at the Green Mountain project. This is, again, a picture of the Kenora Ranch, and much of the Green Mountain Reservoir covered land that was part of the Kenora Ranch. Soon, the ranch was underwater, and they had to move buildings. So Dillon was not the first town that had to be moved. The buildings, the ranch house and all of the outbuildings had to be moved up onto the shores of the reservoir, and the school was destroyed but rebuilt up in what is today Heaney. Heaney is a town that came about after the reservoir was built. And so it's a water project town that wasn't lost, but rather found. The other project that took place in our county, of course, was the Lake Dillon Reservoir. And the building of the dam started in 1961. So it was quite a project. Before the dam was constructed, Dillon looked like this. It was a very established town down in a valley that the Denver Water Board thought was going to be great for holding water. Well, there was a problem. You had to move the town. And that's what they did. Many of the buildings of Old Dillon were moved up to the shores of the new reservoir, including the old schoolhouse, which at the time was a church. Other buildings, though, weren't so fortunate. And so if the building was unable to be moved, then it was destroyed, and fires were dotted all over the town of Dillon, destroying those buildings. And of course, the new town was built up onto the shores. Interestingly enough, at the time that condos were being built in the new town, the ones that were right on the waterfront were very cheap because they did not know how high the reservoir was going to fill up. And so they were uncertain if those condo projects might end up getting flooded. Another town that isn't lost, like Old Dillon, but was found, is the town of Silverthorne. It was another water project town that's worthy of talking about, because where are you going to house all of the workers for the dam and their families? Thus, early Silverthorne was made up of a lot of trailer parks that held the workers. And of course, you know, it has over time become a town of its own. Now, I include Frisco in this because Frisco almost became lost. In the 1930s, there were only 18 people living in the town of Frisco. If it hadn't been for the water project, Frisco could have gone the way of many other of our towns, our lost towns in the county. But it was on the lake. They had a marina. Revival was begun with the water project of Lake Dillon Reservoir. So a quick recap. We had the town of Lakeside that was part of the Kenora Ranch. It had to be moved, or in some cases, the schoolhouse, for instance, was destroyed. It goes away, but the town of Heaney shows up. Same with Old Dillon. Old Dillon had to be moved or destroyed, but in its place came the new town of Dillon. In addition, we had another town that developed, was Silverthorne. And of course, Frisco continues on. Okay, so we want to wrap up our discussion today with talking about winter sports towns. Now, let me remind you that after the mines closed, after the railroads pull out, the towns are struggling. Remember I said Frisco only had 18 people? Well, the Dillon Reservoir certainly helped with bringing that town back, but the other towns were all struggling as well. And so we see that the winter sports begin to really bring life back into the county. Recreation became a way of coping for many of the residents. Things were quiet. So you found that there were little ski slopes dotted all over the county with makeshift tow ropes, and every kid knew how to ski. So that was kind of the beginning of our ski industry. It starts in 1919. With the Dillon ski jump. Now, that was an important ski jump because world records were being broken at that ski jump. And in fact, one of the gentlemen who broke the records in 1919 for ski jumping broke his own record in 1920. And in 1924, Anders Hagens goes to the very first Olympic Games in 1924 in Chamonix, France. So it was a time of real excitement with ski jumping being all new. He, in 1929, comes home with a 4th place. Montezuma had a lot of activity in the area of winter sports, including snowshoeing and Nordic cross-country skiing, and tobogganing was always fun up in that area. But as time went on, we saw that Montezuma closes its post office in 1972. And because the post office closed and all of the businesses left, technically Montezuma is not a town by our definition. Even though it still has a town government, it acts more like a subdivision of Dillon. Then we head up to Climax. Climax had its own ski area that was called Chalk Mountain, 1934 to 1962. Of course, when the mine closed, the ski area closed. But that was a ski area that a lot of famous Olympians trained at, including Dave Gorsuch. His family lived there. And during World War II, the guys over in Camp Hale would come over and compete on Chalk Mountain. So it was one of those first ski areas that really made a difference, at least to the folks of Climax. And then Breckenridge. Breckenridge was a quiet little town before 1960. It had dropped to 393 people. So when it was heading to being a ghost town, when in 1961, the Kansas-based Rounds and Porter Lumber Company decides to put a ski area into Breckenridge. And you can see from these pictures, this is the first lift on Peak 8 that, of course, today looks a whole lot different. And then I mentioned Frisco. Frisco almost died a slow death, but between Lake Dillon and then the ski industry, it has become a thriving community in Summit County. It was in 1992 that the Nordic Center opened up, and in 2010, the Frisco Adventure Park opened up as well. So let's do a quick recap of the winter sports town. Old Dillon goes by the wayside because of the lake, and the Old Dillon ski jump is probably the only ski jump that today is mostly underwater, so it disappears. Montezuma loses its post office. So technically, we're going to say it also went by the wayside. Climax, the mine closes. Chalk Mountain closes. And then, of course, you have Breckenridge and Frisco that are thriving because of winter sports. So once again, let's take a look at Summit County's map and all of the towns that we talked about today that are no longer part of our county's scene, but very much a part of our hiking groups that love to go up and take a look at where these places resided. I want to give a special thanks to the many people who helped put together this program, as it wasn't just a one-person research. I also want to say again, thank you to our corporate sponsor, iFurnish. Now, if you'd like to become a member of Summit Historical Society, we'd love to have you consider joining us. Thank you.